The boardroom was completely silent when Gerald Marsh said my name. Not the polite silence of a meeting that had paused between agenda items. The thick, airless silence of a room where something serious has just landed. Gerald was our chief financial officer. He stood at the head of the conference table with a printed report in his hand and his reading glasses low on his nose. He looked at me over them and said, in a voice that was measured and careful and devastating, $250,000 doesn't simply disappear, Wilhelmina. The report showed a wire transfer. It showed a vendor account modification. And it showed a set of login credentials used to authorize the entire transaction. My credentials. Name. My access code. All eyes in that room moved to me at the same time. I felt the weight of them. I kept my expression steady and my hands flat on the table. I did not look guilty because I was not guilty. But I also noticed something that nobody else in that room had caught yet. Something I kept entirely to myself in that moment, while the silence pressed down on all of us. The timestamp on that transfer report read 9:42 p.m. And I had not been anywhere near that building at 9:42 p.m. By the following morning, I could feel the change before I even reached my desk. People who had greeted me cheerfully for years were suddenly very interested in their screens when I walked past. The Slack channel for our team went quiet whenever I came online. I noticed it in small moments. A conversation that stopped a beat too quickly when I entered the break room. A colleague named Terry who took a different route to the printer to avoid passing me. Lunch invitations that simply did not arrive. The most difficult moment came mid-morning, when Ryan Colbert stopped by my desk. Ryan was my direct colleague in financial operations, someone I had worked alongside for 2 years. He leaned against the partition with his arms loosely folded and looked at me with an expression carefully arranged to communicate concern. "I just want you to know I'm keeping an open mind," he said quietly. "I really hope we figure this out." He held my gaze a second longer than necessary, then walked away. That afternoon HR sent me a calendar invite. The subject line read, "Formal Review, Financial Operations Incident." Attendance was listed as mandatory. My name is Wilhelmina Mills. I am 36 years old, and I have spent the last 10 years building a career in financial operations management. I joined Calderton Financial Services as a mid-level analyst a decade ago, when the company's internal payment systems were outdated and poorly documented. Over the following years, I modernized those systems almost entirely on my own. I designed the vendor payment workflow the company still used. I built the approval architecture, the authentication layers, and the override protocols. I wrote the documentation that new staff were trained on. I had never received a formal disciplinary note in 10 years. Not one. My performance reviews used words like meticulous, indispensable, and exceptionally reliable. I had earned every promotion through work that was careful, documented, and clean. Then Ryan Colbert joined the department 2 years ago as a senior operations analyst. He was confident, sociable, and quick to build relationships with senior leadership. When he arrived, my manager asked me to get him up to speed on the payment systems. I spent weeks training him thoroughly. I showed him everything. I mean that in a way I would later spend a great deal of time thinking about. I showed him absolutely everything. The training lasted almost 3 weeks. Ryan was an attentive student, and at the time I had taken that as a good sign. We sat together each morning in the small training room on the second floor, and I walked him through every layer of the payment authorization system. I explained how vendor accounts were created and verified. I showed him the approval workflow, the token generation process, and the conditions that triggered manual override options. He asked detailed questions. Thorough, specific questions that showed he was paying close attention to how the system's protections worked and, more importantly, where their limits were. I remember thinking he would be a solid addition to the team. On the 4th day of the second week, he made a request I processed without much thought. He said he wanted to run test transactions to make sure he understood the end-to-end process. To do that, he needed temporary admin privileges on the authorization portal. I submitted the access request on his behalf through IT. It was approved for a 2-week window. The window closed. The privileges were supposed to be revoked automatically. I had assumed they were. I had not confirmed it. That assumption would matter more than I could have known. The forensic summary Gerald presented described the incident plainly. At 9:38 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, someone had accessed Calderton's internal payment portal. Using credentials linked to my employee account, they had modified the banking details of a legitimate vendor and redirected the next scheduled payment to an external account. The transfer of $250,000 had cleared by 9:47 p.m. The modification had been made inside a window specifically chosen to avoid the automated verification checks that ran at the top of every hour. Gerald told me this with a careful tone of someone who had read the report 3 times before presenting it. He said the login trail was clear. He said the approval signature was mine. Then he said the building access log showed my credentials had been used to enter the premises that evening. The words landed one after another like objects being set down on a table. Login. Credentials. Building access. Mine. I kept my breathing even and told him the same thing I had told HR that morning. I was not in that building at 9:42 p.m. I had not been there at all that evening. And I could prove it. At 9:42 p.m. on the Tuesday in question, I was sitting at a corner table at a restaurant called The Lantern, 3 miles from the Calderton building. I was having dinner with my sister, Audrey. We had ordered the lamb. We had shared a bottle of white wine, and I remembered the particular quality of the light in that restaurant. Warm amber from low pendant bulbs over each table, the kind that made everything feel slightly golden. Audrey had been talking about a new job offer she was considering, and I had been giving her my honest opinion. I remembered the wine glass in my hand when my phone buzzed with a work notification I did not check, because I was with my sister and had no reason to believe anything was wrong. The restaurant had a reservation in my name. There was a credit card charge timestamped 9:51 p.m., 9 minutes after the transfer cleared. Audrey's phone showed a photo of our desserts at 9:55 p.m. with location metadata confirming the Lantern. I brought all of this to the HR review. Then I decided that waiting was not enough. I asked for something specific. I made the request formally in writing, submitted to both HR and Gerald Marsh on the same morning. I asked for access to the complete security log for the building on the night in question. Not just the transaction log. Not just the login report. The full security infrastructure record. Badge reader data from every entry point, internal camera activity flags, workstation session records, and network access timestamps. HR responded that the logs were under review and would be shared as appropriate. Gerald did not respond directly. I waited 1 day, then followed up and copied the company's legal counsel. That afternoon, an IT administrator named Clive Barton called me. His voice had the careful quality of someone who had already looked at the data and was not entirely comfortable with what he found. He said he would have a preliminary summary ready by Thursday. When I opened his document that evening, I read the first section twice. Then I pulled up the transaction log the company had been using as evidence against me and placed both documents side by side on my screen. The badge entry report did not match the login record. Not even close. The badge entry log showed something straightforward and verifiable. On the night of the transfer, the main building entrance had registered one employee badge between 8:30 p.m. and 10:15 p.m. That badge had been scanned at 8:58 p.m. The employee ID attached to that scan was not mine. It belonged to Ryan Colbert. The log also showed his stated reason for the late entry. 3 days earlier, Ryan had sent a brief message to facilities noting he had left a personal item in the office and might need to come back one evening. Nobody had connected it to the transfer investigation because nobody had thought to look at the badge log separately from the login record. I read the entry 3 times. Ryan's badge had entered the building at 8:58 p.m. The vendor account modification had begun at 9:38 p.m. The transfer cleared at 9:47 p.m. There was no record of any other badge entry that evening. But the login report still showed my credentials as the authorizing account. I forwarded the badge log to internal audit with a single covering note. I wrote, Badge entry at 8:58 p.m. does not match the credential used at 9:42 p.m. Request full VPN and network session logs for this period. Then I waited for what the network logs would show. The network logs came back 48 hours later. Clive Barton delivered them personally, which I took as a sign that he understood their significance. He walked me through the findings without editorial comment, the way a careful professional presents data that speaks clearly on its own. The transfer authorization had been initiated from a specific workstation inside the building. That workstation was located in Conference Room B on the 3rd floor. It was not a general-use machine. Conference Room B was a secure meeting room that required a physical badge scan to enter, and the workstation inside it connected to the internal payment portal through a hardwired network line rather than standard wireless access. Because of that hardwired connection, the workstation left a distinct fingerprint in the network session log. The session that had initiated the transfer was tied to that specific machine. And the badge log for Conference Room B showed clearly which employee had scanned into that room on the night in question. The same badge that had entered the main building at 8:58 p.m. had scanned into Conference Room B at 9:35 p.m., 3 minutes before the transaction process began. It was Ryan Colbert's badge number. 1 badge. 1 entry. 1 person in that room. I did not go to Gerald Marsh directly. I understood that the moment I named Ryan, the conversation would shift from evidence to accusation, and accusations without a complete picture were easier to dismiss than people realized. I needed everything assembled before anyone else looked at it. So I compiled my findings into a single organized document. The badge log entry at 8:58 p.m. The Conference Room B scan at 9:35 p.m. The workstation network session tied to that room. The timestamp on the vendor modification. The transfer clearance at 9:47 p.m. My alibi documentation. The restaurant reservation, the credit card charge at 9:51 p.m. Audrey's timestamped photo. I added a brief explanatory note connecting each element in chronological order. I did not write Ryan's name in the summary. I let the timestamps do that work instead. Then I sent the entire package to the internal audit team with a subject line that read, "Security log findings, for audit review." I did not copy anyone who might alert Ryan before the audit team reviewed the data. Within 2 hours, I received a response from the audit director, Constance Adler. Her reply was 4 words. CFO has been notified. By the following morning, Gerald Marsh had ordered a full forensic investigation. After the forensic investigation was ordered, something shifted in Ryan's behavior. Before the announcement, his manner toward me had been studied sympathy. After it, the performance changed in a way I found easier to read than he probably realized. He started appearing near my desk more frequently, asking how I was holding up, saying he was sure things would be resolved. On one occasion he placed his hand on my shoulder while he spoke and left it there a beat longer than any ordinary gesture of comfort required. He made a point of speaking warmly about me in front of colleagues, volunteering observations about my professionalism at moments that felt slightly too deliberate. I recognized it for what it was. Overcorrection. The behavior of someone who had calculated that visible friendliness toward the accused was its own form of protection against scrutiny. I responded with measured professionalism each time and did not reveal anything about what the security logs had shown. Meanwhile, the forensic team was conducting its own parallel review. On a Thursday afternoon, the lead investigator contacted me to say their analysis had identified something specific in the session data. There had been 2 active credential sessions on the Conference Room B workstation within a single 60-second window. The forensic team's explanation of the dual login session was precise and methodical. On the night of the transfer, the Conference Room B workstation had recorded 2 separate active credential sessions within less than 60 seconds. My credentials had been used to open the authorization portal. Ryan's credentials had also been active on the same machine in the same window. In a normal scenario, that would be technically impossible without administrator-level access. Standard workstations could not run parallel authenticated sessions from 2 different users. To achieve it on the Calderton system, someone would need to use an admin override function that allowed a secondary session to be opened temporarily alongside a primary one. The forensic team noted that the admin override had been used, and they flagged the date on which that override capability had been granted. It had been requested 6 weeks before the transfer took place. The request had been submitted by Ryan Colbert, with a stated justification of cross-departmental coverage support. It had been approved by a mid-level IT administrator who had not flagged it for additional review. The admin override that made the credential manipulation possible had been sitting in Ryan's account for 6 weeks. He had planned for this well in advance. The paper trail that emerged over the following days made everything else make sense in retrospect. The forensic team pulled Ryan's internal email records as part of their authorized review scope. In a thread from 8 weeks before the transfer, Ryan had pushed back against a proposed system update that would have added a secondary authentication requirement for vendor account modifications. His stated reason was operational efficiency. He wrote that the additional step would slow processing during high-volume periods. The IT team had agreed to delay the update pending further review. It was never implemented. The forensic team also identified 3 smaller transactions in the weeks before the main transfer that had not been authorized correctly. They had been flagged by the automated monitoring system and blocked before clearing. The blocked transactions were not connected to my credentials. They were connected to vendor accounts that matched the profile of the account ultimately used in the successful transfer. The pattern was clear when the investigators laid it out in sequence. Ryan had been testing the system. He had identified the authentication gap. He had made sure the gap stayed open. He had probed the vendor modification process until he understood exactly how to use it. The main transfer had not been impulsive. It had been the final step in a calculated process. Constance Adler requested the internal security camera footage on a Friday afternoon. The request required sign-off from both legal counsel and Gerald Marsh, and it was granted within 2 hours, which told me the investigation had moved into a phase where the people above me were no longer uncertain about its direction. The footage was reviewed by the forensic team over the weekend. On Monday morning, Constance called me into her office and showed me a still image captured from the conference room B camera. The timestamp read 9:38 p.m. A figure was seated at the workstation in the dim light of the room, visible from the side in partial profile. He was leaning toward the screen, typing. He had paused and turned his head slightly, in the way someone looks up from focused work when a thought crosses their mind. Even in partial profile, from the build and the posture and the particular way the figure sat in the chair, I recognized him immediately. The forensic team had also noted something else from the footage review. At 9:41 p.m., 1 minute before the transfer was authorized, the figure in conference room B had taken out a phone and placed a call. The call lasted 4 minutes. The phone call was documented through the building's internal communication log, which captured outbound calls made from mobile devices connected to the building's Wi-Fi network. The log showed a call placed from Ryan Colbert's registered mobile number at 9:41 p.m. on the night of the transfer. It had lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The recipient number appeared twice more in Ryan's communication records, once in the week before the transfer and once in the week after. The forensic team ran the number through available verification tools and identified it as connected to an individual with no formal relationship to Calderton Financial Services. That line of inquiry was handed off to legal counsel for further review. I was not told everything they uncovered about that number, and I did not ask. What I understood from the timeline was enough. The call had been placed while the transfer was in progress, from inside the building, from the room where the transaction was being executed, from the phone of the only person whose badge log placed him there. When Ryan came to my desk the following Tuesday with his arranged expression of concern, I told him I was fine and thanked him. The most powerful thing I could do was nothing visible at all. When the forensic investigation presented its preliminary findings to the board's oversight committee, Ryan was given the opportunity to respond. He had retained a personal attorney by that point, which told the room something on its own. His attorney advised him to limit his statements, but Ryan spoke anyway. He said the dual session anomaly was a technical glitch in the workstation's session management. He said the badge log correlation was circumstantial. He said he had entered the building that evening to retrieve a personal item from his desk on the second floor, not to access conference room B. The IT lead on the forensic team, a precise man named Barry Holt, responded to each point in sequence. He explained that the session overlap could not occur through a glitch because the system required active credential input, a password typed in real time, for each session to open. He explained that the conference room B badge scan was a physical record that could not be attributed to software error. He explained that session mirroring of the kind Ryan described did not exist in Calderton's current architecture. There was no glitch. The committee noted the response without comment and moved to the next item. The committee had asked Ryan one central question during the formal review. When had he first become aware that the vendor payment authorization system used credential-based access that could theoretically be replicated if admin override functions were active? Ryan said he had not been aware of that possibility until the investigation brought it to his attention. He said his knowledge of the system extended only to what Wilhelmina had taught him during training, and that his understanding did not cover session management or authentication overlap. He said this with the steady composure of someone who had practiced the answer. The committee then read into the record the email thread in which Ryan had argued against the secondary authentication update 8 weeks before the transfer. They noted the email demonstrated specific knowledge of authentication workflow mechanics. They noted the timing of the admin override request. 6 weeks before the transfer, 2 weeks after that email. They noted Ryan had claimed to assume the system's credential security was entirely internal. The committee's summary used one word to describe the gap between his stated assumption and the documented evidence. That word was implausible. A formal leadership review was initiated that afternoon. 3 days after the formal leadership review was initiated, Calderton's legal counsel presented the oversight committee with a critical concern. The evidence trail was substantial. The badge logs, workstation session data, admin override timeline, camera footage, and phone call record all pointed in one direction. But legal counsel advised that for any action beyond internal disciplinary process, intent would need to be established beyond reasonable doubt. Intent was harder to prove than access. It required showing not just that Ryan had been in the room and had used the system, but that he had deliberately planned to do so. The committee acknowledged the point and sat with it for a moment. The forensic team lead, Barry Holt, said his team had been anticipating exactly this question and had continued their review of Ryan's personal work devices as part of their authorized scope. That same afternoon, they submitted a supplementary filing that changed the tone of the discussion entirely. During their review of Ryan's own assigned desktop workstation, the team had recovered deleted files using standard data recovery tools. The files had been deleted within the 48-hour window after the transfer was discovered by the company. What the files contained when recovered was the piece that brought everything together. The recovered files included a spreadsheet the forensic team had partially reconstructed from fragmented data. It was not complete. Some cells were unreadable, but enough survived to show what it had been. The spreadsheet contained columns tracking authentication window timing, the duration of automated verification checks that ran at the top of each hour, and a series of calculated time gaps. The column headers used abbreviations, but the forensic team's analysis made their meaning plain. The spreadsheet was a planning document. It identified the specific window between verification cycles in which a vendor modification could be authorized and cleared before the automated system flagged it. That window was 22 minutes. The actual transfer had taken 9. Attached in the same recovered file folder was a handwritten note saved as an image file. It contained 4 lines of figures and 2 words the forensic team highlighted in their summary. The words were written at the bottom of the note in small letters, underlined twice. They read, "Use W. Legal counsel read the recovered file summary in silence." Then she looked at the committee chair and said the threshold for establishing intent had been met. The committee requested a final external audit to formalize the findings before taking action. Ryan was placed on administrative leave on a Wednesday morning, notified by HR through a formal letter delivered to his desk before the rest of the team arrived. I was not in the office when it happened. A colleague named Petra Wiles sent me a message that afternoon saying he had left the building with his bag and HR had issued a brief notice about temporary leave pending review. When I came in the following day, the atmosphere had changed in a way I had not anticipated. It was not dramatic. Nobody made a speech. But the quality of the air was different. People looked at me when I walked in. Not with the avoidance of the previous 2 weeks, but with direct, quiet acknowledgement. Few colleagues nodded. Terry, who had taken the long route to the printer during the worst of it, stopped me near the coffee station and said she was glad things were moving in the right direction. I understood that most people were still cautious, still waiting for the external audit to confirm what the internal investigation had found. I was cautious too. But I sat at my desk that Thursday morning and did my work without the weight of 38 pairs of eyes deciding what I was. That felt like enough for now. The external forensic audit was conducted by a third-party firm with no prior relationship to Calderton. They were given unrestricted access to the same logs, records, and recovered files the internal team had reviewed. Their process took 11 business days. When their report arrived, Gerald Marsh read it and then called Constance Adler and legal counsel into his office. I know this because Constance told me afterward, during the meeting where she shared the conclusions with me directly. The external firm's findings were stated without hedging. The vendor payment modification had been executed through deliberate and manual credential manipulation by an individual who had used administrator-level override access to replicate an authorized user session on a secured workstation. The manipulation had been preceded by identifiable preparation activity, including failed test transactions and system permission acquisition. The report classified the act as premeditated financial fraud. It used the word calculated in its executive summary. And it stated clearly that the credentials belonging to Wilhelmina Mills had been used without her knowledge or presence. I read that sentence twice. Then Constance looked at me across the desk and said, "The termination letter is being drafted. The CFO would like to meet with you in the boardroom on Friday morning." I said I would be there. Ryan's termination was processed on a Thursday. There was no announcement beyond a brief HR memo describing a personnel change in the financial operations department, and noting the matter had been resolved following internal and external review. His name was not in the memo. His desk was cleared by facilities staff. His access credentials were revoked at 8 a.m. By mid-morning, the only visible sign he had worked there was a coffee mug that someone had moved to the communal kitchen counter because they were not sure what else to do with it. I was at my desk when it happened, working on a vendor reconciliation report delayed during the investigation. A colleague passed by around 9:30 and said quietly, "It's done." I nodded and kept working. I did not feel triumph. I had spent 2 weeks watching my reputation questioned by people who had known me for a decade. And what I felt most clearly on that Thursday was exhaustion and relief. Not the loud kind. The kind that settles slowly into your chest when something that has been pressing on you for a long time is finally lifted. I submitted my report at 11:45. Then I went to lunch alone, ate a full meal, and walked back through the lobby with my name still on the directory by the elevator. Gerald Marsh was already in the boardroom when I arrived on Friday morning. So was Constance Adler, the company's legal counsel, and 2 members of the oversight committee. The room felt different from the last time I had sat in it, when all eyes had been on me in that awful silence. This time there were 6 people and the atmosphere was careful but warm. Gerald stood when I came in, which was not something he typically did. He asked me to sit. Then he told me clearly, without preamble, that the board wished to formally apologize. A written apology on company letterhead was slid across the table. It was specific. It named the accusation. It named the outcome. It acknowledged the error in allowing the accusation to affect my standing before the evidence was fully reviewed. Then Gerald told me the board was prepared to offer me the role of Director of Financial Integrity, a position carrying executive-level authority over Calderton's internal control systems. The compensation was significantly above my current salary. He told me the role was mine if I wanted it. Then he waited. I set the apology letter down on the table. And I paused before answering. I told Gerald I was honored by the offer and prepared to accept it under 3 specific conditions. The first was full independent authority over internal controls design, including the ability to implement security changes without requiring approval from the department I was overseeing. The second was a dedicated budget for system upgrades, specifically the secondary authentication feature that had been delayed, along with additional monitoring infrastructure I would specify. The third condition was not about money or authority. I asked for a formal company-wide communication stating clearly that the investigation had concluded, that the transfer was the result of credential fraud by a third party, and that I had been fully exonerated. I asked that my name appear in that communication explicitly. Gerald looked at legal counsel, then at Constance, then back at me. He asked if I would give them an hour to confirm the third condition with the board. I told him to take whatever time they needed. An hour and 20 minutes later, Constance came to my desk and said all 3 conditions had been approved unanimously. I saved the confirmation email. Then I closed my laptop and went home early for the first time in 3 weeks. The all-hands meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in the main conference room. Every Calderton employee was required to attend, in person or by video link. Gerald Marsh stood at the front in the same spot where he had said my name in that awful silence 3 weeks earlier. This time the room was full and expectant. He spoke for 4 minutes. He outlined the investigation. He described the forensic findings. He named the credential fraud and attributed it to a former employee. Then he said the words I had written into the third condition of my acceptance. He said, Wilhelmina Mills was wrongfully accused of an act she did not commit. The evidence confirms she was not present, was not involved, and acted with complete integrity throughout. We owe her an apology and her full standing in this organization, and both have been given. The applause started before he finished. I stood near the right side of the room and accepted it without a performance. No tears. No dramatic gesture. Just the steady feeling of a person who had done the right things in the right order and waited for the truth. He thought he could bury me under a transaction log. He forgot something about systems. They record everything. And the truth does not panic. Wait.